Hello and welcome once again to Baked Beans Garage, where it ain't got no gas in it. Today I plan to address that with this here. Sorry, mirror. Here's a tank. I'm gonna put that in, but I also need to address everything between there and here, so let's get into it. So here's the situation. Last time you saw me put together this whole engine, ye old D24T, I talked about timing the pump, putting in the injectors, all that. So now we gotta address everything back here to the tank. So here is that, the inside of which is remarkably clean. Diesel doesn't quite varnish up quite as bad as gasoline does, so I'm not even gonna have to clean that out too bad. If you do have a gasoline tank, what's quite nasty inside, you can throw some random bolts and nuts in there, then maybe some degreaser, kerosene, some kind of, I don't know, Varsol if you're 97 years old, and just shake it around to break all that goop up, and that'll clean it out quite nicely. Over here we have all the tank hardware, the straps and the mounts. We'll make them prettier later on in this episode. There's the sending unit housing, the gasket, the nut, got a new fuel filter, some fresh new tubing to make some new fuel lines, the hard lines anyway, a couple wires, the sending unit itself, the level sensor. So we'll go over all this today. First thing I need to address is the old sending unit housing has some rust right there. Gonna need to patch that up. And don't know if you can see that all too well on camera, but there seems to be some kind of copper in there behind the steel. So I'm not going to be able to weld that, but JB Weld is safe to use on fuel tank applications, so we're going to do that. Now, as you may be able to tell, I've already cleaned this up with quite many wire wheels, what for knocking all the crust and the rust off, and that's when I uncovered the old hole there. Side note, VDO made in Germany. VDO, that was pretty much the standard in the 80s and 90s for European car instrumentation. Volvo, Volkswagen used them for many years. Very trustworthy brand. So anyways, I'm just gonna back this up with some tape, so the epoxy doesn't drip down underneath, and then just slather a layer on top. And while that cures up, we can start to have a look at this sending unit itself here. So right here we have our rheostat, what sends the level of the fuel juice to the dash. And that guy just pops out of those two clips right there, and it is also the hinge pin that guy rotates around. So we can take this off and look at the little wiper right there, and that's what's contacting the variable resistor down the bottom. You want to make sure you got your spring tension, that surface is nice and clean. It appears to be so. Right here we have this slipper ring that the bottom end of this arm contacts, and that's what gives you your constant lubricants up through the wires and whatnot. So I'm going to give those a clean with some Scotch-Brite, and then I will get on to testing this. I also believe I forgot to mention, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Pretty much any, Chinese reproduction of these parts aren't going to be nearly as good as the OEM. So if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Anyways, a little operating principle. This little ball is what floats on top of your fuel, and yeah, just moves that wiper arm across that resistive element and changes what it's sending to the gauge. Can you turn on? Now this little fella was 10 bucks, and it's auto everything. It does like all the basic stuff. I figured can't really go wrong for 10 bucks for a backup meter, and I'm honestly kind of a fan of it. And the ohms you're seeing don't really matter, because that's not going to change unless you have like the actual original specifications for this rheostat, which, we don't. All you want to do is make sure there's no dead spots where it shows an open circuit, and just move it up and down real nice and slow, and make sure that the resistance changes smoothly. And this appears to have a range of about 315 ohms all the way up to around 30. And I'm not seeing any dead spots where that resistance reading drops out to either an open or just a closed circuit. So I think this guy is pretty good. So back at the housing here, this is nice and cured up. Here we have the feed through, what lets the electrons dance up and down across this barrier. This guy's just a friction fit down into there, and as you can see, there's this little tang what was spot welded straight to the top of the housing, and then the ground end of the sensor just plugs on to a little spade connector down here. So I kind of broke this when I took it apart, but that shouldn't be an issue. There's just an O-ring at the bottom here that I've replaced. And since I'm gonna have to resolder this little tang back to the bottom there, I'm gonna scuff that area. And again, this isn't something that you should take apart. It's just something that kind of got taken apart. So if you're not familiar with soldering, first you gotta tin both parts that you're soldering together, which means you heat it up enough for the solder to wick into it. Well, I guess I probably should have done that first. And here I have the trusty old $3 Harbor Freight soldering iron. This is pretty much all I use, because, I mean, it works, and it's efficient. So that didn't work at all. An important thing to consider is when you're using a little soldering iron, this is basically a heat reservoir. So that's all the heat you have to use, and when you're trying to do a big part like Zoe, you might not get it hot enough before you run out of heat in the reservoir before it'll take the solder. So, if this doesn't work, nothing will. Fun fact, I can feel this thing vibrating with the 60 hertz coming out of the wall. Usually use this thing to solder two moving cars together. And I am melting some of the nylon on the little housing there, but that was a calculated risk. It'll be fine. And now that that is indeed soldered, not the most beautiful job, I'll admit, but as long as we have some decent solder flow down into the metal itself, we know we have some good bonding, although it is a bit ugly. I'm kind of afraid of that thing. I'm not going to be able to touch it until tomorrow morning at the earliest. And with that installed, kinda, we can go ahead and throw the sending unit assembly back on. Ooh. So we have this longer tube here. This spring goes on first, what for keeping the sending unit hammered down into the bottom of the tank. And we just slide that guy on thus ways. And it comes through this slot and then locks in like so. So originally this had just a little spade connector here to ground the rheostat there, but I don't like that, so I'm just going to hard solder that connection for better connection. And up here we can see on the bottom end of the little feed through is where that guy went, so I gotta redo that because I broke it. And with that prettied back up, we can throw it back in the tank. Again, original Volvo rubbers, still in perfect shape. Isn't even all swollen up like all the 80s rigs I've taken apart. So don't replace it if you don't have to. It's gonna last longer than any aftermarket you're liable to find these days. Oh, I forget, relearn every single time I do it. Do you put it on the sender or do you put it in the tank first? I remember. You put it halfway on so you can get the lip set down in there and then push it the rest of the way in. If you've ever done like a Volkswagen brake caliper, you know what I mean. And if you haven't, just figure it out. And now I just need to prettyify the straps and the brackets before that can go in, so montage. Pretty fresh under there. Only a few notes. You gotta put in, you actually gotta lift the tank up into the slot before you put in this across the ways bracket. That'll hang up on the sending unit if you don't. I also used some more of that universal window weather stripping on the bottom of the straps for preventing vibrations and rattles and such. So now we can move on to the hard lines. So here's what I'll be using. This is just some aluminized steel 8mm tubing. For hamburger language, that's 1/200th of a dishwasher or 5/16 of an inch. Got the question extractor there, got a flaring tool, a little basic bender and tubing cutter. There's some tubes I already took off of the roll. As you can see, one's quite a lot straighter than the other. That's what the question extractor there is for. So for the terminations at each end, I'm just going to do a little bubble flare like you'd do for a brake line, and that'll hold the hoses on nice and good. Even though this is a diesel, so there's no actual high pressure fuel pump, I still don't like just putting a hose on a unflared end just like that, but that's factory, so that can stay that way. So this is a pretty nifty little implement to use. All you do, set your tube in between those two sets of rollers and it ratchets down, and then you just start running it back and forth, and as it gets straighter you incrementally twist that guy in there. And while you're doing this, you also gotta turn it around so you're not just putting another big radius into it. So yeah, just do that, keep tightening on here and go back and forth a million times. And yes, admittedly, that step is entirely cosmetic. Now for actually putting them in the car. So from the factory, the fuel lines come from the fuel filter up in that area somewhere. They run along the inside of this frame rail, I suppose, then across the floor, over here, through the drive shaft hoop, and then up alongside the fuel tank. Ooh. With any kind of rigid lines, like brake lines or fuel lines, you're best at starting where your most complicated bend is going to be, and then working across from either end from that point. So I got a piece of TIG filler rod here. I'm gonna mock up and get the bends that I need and then try to replicate that with the fuel line. That's still not very fun, but about the easiest way you can do this. All right, now since from the factory, the return line would have been smaller than the feed line, so I'm gonna have to do something other than the original clips. So I'm just gonna use these Adel clamps and some self-tapping tech screws here. Now, if you do this wrong, this is gonna be an absolute rust magnet later. So once I get them all hung with these screws, I'm gonna go through, take them all out, and then slather some sealant and rust inhibitor in there so they're nice and tight and not corroding on me later. Silly me, I've gone and bought the child-proof ones by accident. Give a guy a minute. As for the business end, from the factory, these fuel lines did some kind of Windows XP screensaver nonsense down around the brake proportioning valve, but I think I'm going to simplify that up a little bit, so I just ran them straight here. I got a banjo fitting to replace that barb, and yeah, I'm going to finish these up, then drop them all out again to do the flares. So now, to put the flares on, I got this fancy schmancy mandrel type professional bender. Still like $100-something on the Jungle website. Well worth it in my opinion. You could use the style like this if you hate yourself enough, but if you do enough of them with this, you just get sick and tired. And it's not laziness if you call it efficiency. Also has the benefit of giving you nice, uniform, perfect flares every time. And you just put it in the die, make it level, and then tighten that down. Or make it even with the end. The casting of the die has a, I guess you could call it a counter bore that leaves the perfect amount for the flare once you get it flush with the end like that. And you don't need to crank this down nearly as hard as if you're doing like a bubble flare on a brake line. Lovely. And with that, we have a nice little flare for the tubing to grab onto. Of course, this being a diesel, VE pump, there's no high pressure fuel, but you can do this just fine on like a modern EFI car, and that will hold all the PSIs you need. Sorry, Swedes, I do look at my analytics. That'll hold all the bars you need back to the car. The clamps have kind of danced all over. Can I have a clamp, please? They're making me look like an idiot. Well, making me look like more of an idiot, I suppose. What am I doing? On the wrong side of the parking brake cable. Who made these lines? Idiot. Which goes where? That looks mostly right. I forgot to account for my own incompetence while planning the bends. So my main concern is that between the faces of this 8L clamp, it will let water ingress. So I'm going to squirt some RTV between the two halves and then around where the screw goes in, two halves on the other side, and then also give the screw itself a little bath. So all that remains is a fresh new Wix filter. And with that, the fuel system's pretty much done. Guess I'll note for the unfamiliar, that little knob on the bottom, most diesels, this isn't just a fuel filter, it's also a water separator. So periodically you'll loosen that and that'll drain all the water out the bottom, because water is heavier than diesel and it sinks to the bottom. So moving forward, the next step is going to be starting to throw some wires into the car, maybe get that sending unit and gauge working, but that'll be next time. So yeah, I guess that's it for now. So if you're still watching, just know I appreciate you. I do hope you found this video informative or entertaining or something like that. Yeah, like I said, next time we're going to start throwing some wires and fixing the many broken ones that were in this rig. So this has been Baked Beans Garage. I am Chinchilla, and I'll see you next time.